In the face of relentless storms and howling winds, a lone man stands beside a strange cabin shaped like an arrow pointed straight into the storm. His neighbors scoff, calling it foolish, until the first storm hits. As nature tests the strength of his creation, the true power of his innovation will be revealed. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The wind howled across the barren landscape, biting at every exposed inch of flesh. On a ridge far from the nearest town, Elias stood frozen, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His eyes were locked on the shape before him, a cabin unlike any other in the region, designed with a pointed roof that sliced through the wind. It was an absurd sight to the other settlers, who had gathered in groups to laugh at his expense. The cabin was a sharp contrast to the rough log structures scattered throughout the frontier. Most of the trappers and pioneers here built their homes with heavy timber and thick walls to shield them from the harsh weather, but not Elias. His cabin, designed like an arrowhead, stood tall against the wilderness, its angle cutting directly into the biting wind, a peculiar vision amidst the vast emptiness. The locals couldn't help but snicker. "He's building a house for a storm that'll never come," one man muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But Elias was no stranger to isolation. He'd lived in the wilderness long enough to understand the land's unpredictable temperament. His fingers tightened around the axe handle he held, eyes still on the cabin. The wind carried whispers of doubt from the crowd behind him, but he paid them no mind. The wilderness had never cared for conventional wisdom. Why should he? For months the idea had been brewing in his mind. The cabin was not just shelter, but a statement that he would not bend to the harsh elements. Instead, he would face them head on. It wasn't just the wind he sought to outwit, but the very nature of survival itself. If the mountains could break you, it was better to meet them with the strength of the land. And that was what his cabin represented. The construction had taken weeks longer than he had initially expected, the materials heavier and the labor more taxing than he'd prepared for. The design, after all, was unconventional, but there was no turning back now. This was his challenge, and he had built the cabin as his fortress against the elements. Though the storm had not yet arrived, Elias knew that in the coming days it would, and when it did, he would be ready. Still, as the day wore on, the laughter from the men grew louder, mixing with the sound of the wind. They called him mad, a dreamer wasting his time. But Elias, stoic as ever, only responded by turning his back to them, taking the first step toward his cabin. This was his test, and the world would soon see if he had been right. That night the wind picked up, howling through the valley like a wild beast. Inside the cabin, Elias sat by the fire, a faint glow of warmth casting long shadows on the walls. He listened to the sound of the wind, a constant reminder of the forces at work outside. The cabin creaked slightly, but it held firm. He knew there was more to come. The storm was not finished yet. He had been out in these mountains long enough to know the signs. The sky, dark and angry, told him that the storm would not relent. Yet the fire crackling before him was a source of comfort. It was a reminder of his defiance, that despite the mocking laughs, despite the scorn of his neighbors, he had built something that would stand. The wind battered the cabin, its fury crashing against the angled roof. Elias had designed it for this very reason, to direct the force of the storm away from the structure. As the hours dragged on, the gusts grew stronger. The flaps of his cabin's canvas shutters whipped violently, but not a single gust breached the walls. Outside, the storm was now in full force. The snow blew sideways, stinging the air with each gust. Elias leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he listened. It was at that moment he realized the world outside had transformed. The mocking voices of the settlers were no longer audible, lost in the fury of the storm. All that remained was the howl of the wind, the crackling of his fire, and the steady rhythm of the cabin, holding strong. The night stretched on, but Elias was unbothered. He had built this cabin to endure, not just survive. As he lay on his bedroll, the wind outside seemed to grow more desperate, more violent. But inside there was peace. The mocking had stopped, replaced by a sense of quiet. It was as if the storm had begun to recognize what the settlers had yet to learn. This cabin, in all its oddity, had a strength they had not understood. Morning arrived, bringing with it a biting cold. Elias stepped outside and immediately saw the marks of the storm's fury. Snow drifted high against the edges of the land. The winds had left their scars on the landscape, but there was one place untouched, his cabin. While every other structure in the valley had been battered and shifted by the night's storm, his stood firm. The arrow-shaped cabin had not budged an inch. Elias walked around it, inspecting the damage. No walls had buckled, no windows had broken. It was, as he had planned, untouched. A slight smile tugged at his lips as he realized the truth. The men who had laughed were nowhere to be seen. They had retreated to their homes, hiding from the storm that had now passed. Elias knew this storm was just the beginning. There would be more, harsher, and colder. But as the wind slowed and the first light of day bathed the land, Elias stood tall, proud of the structure he had created. The storm had passed around him. His cabin had withstood the test, and the men who had once left would soon find that it was no longer foolishness to think differently. The wind had died down by the time Elias awoke the next morning. The landscape bathed in pale sunlight that reflected off the snow, casting long shadows over the valley. For a moment he stood still at the doorway, the cold biting at his exposed skin, but the sight before him filled him with a quiet sense of pride. His cabin had held against the worst the storm could offer. The storm had raged through the land, but it had passed around him. But now, as Elias surveyed the clearing, he saw a group of figures making their way across the snow-covered land. They moved cautiously, as if unsure of the path to take, but their presence was undeniable. It was the neighbors, the men who had laughed at him, the ones who had questioned his decision to build his cabin the way he had. Now they were here, moving in his direction, no doubt drawn by the silence that had settled over the valley in the storm's wake. Elias turned back into the warmth of his cabin, his mind shifting into the defensive stance he had honed over years of living on the frontier. He didn't need anyone's approval. He didn't need their approval then, and he didn't need it now, but the thought of their scorn, their laughter, lingered like a bitter taste on the back of his tongue. He stepped to the door and watched as the men arrived, one by one, each dragging a sled loaded with tools and supplies. They had come to see the so-called madman's house. Their faces were flushed with cold, but there was something else there too, curiosity. They had been silent for the better part of the walk, but as they approached, their eyes began to take in the structure before them. Elias leaned against the doorframe, watching them with quiet amusement. They were too proud to admit they'd been wrong, but they were here. That, in itself, was a form of recognition. He didn't need to speak, not yet. He simply watched as they circled the cabin, inspecting it with their eyes, running fingers along the rough-hewn edges of the wooden planks. After a few long moments, one of the men finally spoke up. "Well, I'll be damned." It wasn't a compliment, but there was no mistaking the awe in his voice. "Looks like it held up through the storm. Hell, it looks like it could take a lot more." Elias simply nodded, not bothered by the grudging respect in the tone. "I built it to last." The man who spoke, a trapper named Garrett, nodded in return, his brow furrowing. "We didn't think it'd work. Thought you were wasting your time, Elias. Guess we were wrong." Elias didn't respond at first, but then he pushed himself off the doorframe and moved toward them. He didn't need to explain. The cabin had spoken for itself. Garrett continued, "You mind if we take a look inside? We're curious, see what you've done different." Elias thought about it for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing them in. The interior was just as much a testament to his careful design as the exterior. The fire still crackled in the corner, and the shelves along the walls were neatly organized, evidence of a home rather than a temporary shelter. He had designed every inch of it with a purpose, for survival, yes, but also for comfort. As the men moved around inspecting the craftsmanship, they didn't speak. It wasn't necessary. The glances exchanged between them spoke volumes. They were beginning to understand that Elias had built something that worked, something that defied the conventional wisdom of the frontier. They left a short while later, their initial skepticism now tempered with quiet respect. No words were exchanged on the way out, but Elias knew what had happened. His cabin had passed its first real test, not from the storm, but from the men who had doubted him. They hadn't admitted defeat, but they no longer laughed. That, for Elias, was enough. The days that followed were calm as the storm's fury receded and the landscape returned to its usual state of stillness. But Elias knew that calm was temporary. The weather on the frontier was nothing if not unpredictable. He had built his cabin with the expectation that it would endure. Now he would test it for himself. He had heard whispers from other trappers in the area about a new storm brewing to the east. The weather was turning cold again, and this time the prediction said it would be worse than before. Elias wasn't concerned about the cold. He had prepared for that. But what truly concerned him was the wind. He had tested the cabin against a standard winter storm. This time, the storm was forecasted to carry a different kind of power, the kind that could tear a man's shelter apart if it wasn't built to withstand it. For the next few days, Elias worked quietly, securing the cabin, gathering firewood, and making sure every last detail was in place. He spent hours preparing, not just for himself, but for the cabin's true test. The foundation was solid, the logs tightly fitted, and the roof, that strange, angular roof, was designed to direct the wind away. But would it hold? Could it withstand the power of nature's wrath? When the storm hit, it came with a force that seemed almost personal. The wind howled, louder than Elias had ever heard before. It rattled the windows and shook the cabin as if trying to pry it loose from the earth. The walls groaned under the pressure and the roof creaked, but Elias remained calm. He had prepared for this. As the storm raged outside, Elias stayed inside, feeding the fire and checking every corner of the cabin. The wind battered against the arrow-shaped roof, but it worked exactly as he had planned. The angled roof directed the wind away from the structure, allowing the force to pass harmlessly by. He couldn't help but smile as the storm raged around him, knowing that every decision he had made was now proving itself. The cabin held firm, unshaken by the furious winds that tried to tear it apart. By morning, the storm had passed. Elias stepped outside, squinting into the blinding light of the early sun. The world around him was covered in a thick layer of snow, but there was no damage to the cabin. The storm had left its mark on everything else: fallen trees, uprooted shrubs, and scattered debris. But Elias's cabin stood unscathed, a lone sentinel against the forces of nature. It was no longer just a shelter. It was proof. Proof that his design worked. Proof that he had been right all along. And as he stood there, looking at the pristine structure, Elias knew this was just the beginning. The frontier was harsh, unforgiving, but he had built something that would endure, not just for him, but for anyone who needed it. His cabin was more than just wood and stone. It was a testament to the power of innovation, of defying the odds, and standing strong in the face of adversity. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley as Elias worked outside his cabin. He had spent the morning gathering firewood and tightening the rope that held the canvas shutters in place. The storm had passed, but Elias knew that another would come, as relentless as the last. He wasn't bothered by the incoming weather. His cabin had proven itself, but now the real test would be whether or not others would see it the way he did. As he stacked logs, the familiar sound of boots crunching over the snow reached his ears. Elias didn't need to look up to know who it was. Garrett, the trapper who had come by a few days ago, was heading toward him. Behind him, another figure appeared. A man Elias hadn't seen before, dressed in furs and carrying a rifle over his shoulder. "You the one built that cabin out there?" The new man's voice was rough, carrying the weight of the wilderness. He didn't sound rude, but there was a directness in his tone that left little room for pleasantries. Elias stood and wiped his hands on his coat, dusting off the dirt and snow before answering. "I did." Garrett, standing nearby, looked between the two men. "This is Tanner. He's been traveling west for a while. Heard about your cabin from some folks at a trading post. Thought he'd come to see it for himself." Elias nodded slowly, sizing up the new arrival. Tanner's face was weathered, his eyes sharp, and there was a hardness to his posture that spoke of years spent surviving the wilderness. Elias knew the type. A man who didn't waste time on idle chatter. A man who respected what worked, whether it was a trap or a cabin. "Well, I can tell you that it held up," Garrett said, his tone softening. "We had that storm a few days back. It didn't budge. Nothing like the old cabins. I reckon Elias here knows what he's doing." Tanner looked toward the cabin, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" he muttered, as if testing the idea, weighing the truth of it. Then, without another word, he began walking toward the cabin. Elias watched him, unsure what to expect. If the men had laughed before, now they were sizing him up. This was the moment Elias had been preparing for. The storm had shown the strength of his design, but what was still uncertain was whether others would understand its value. Tanner entered the cabin without hesitation, followed closely by Garrett. Elias, standing outside, waited. It was an odd feeling. Not quite expectation, but something close to it. For years he had worked in isolation, crafting his creation to be perfect in the face of nature's wrath. But now, others were seeing it, and he wasn't sure what to feel about that. Minutes passed before the door creaked open again. Tanner stepped outside, his face unreadable. He looked at Elias, then back at the cabin as if coming to a conclusion. "Not bad," Tanner said, his voice surprisingly respectful. "Might not look like much, but it's solid. I'd trust my life to it." A silent pride settled over Elias, but he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded. He had built the cabin to survive, not to impress. But hearing those words, hearing the respect in Tanner's voice, felt like the validation he hadn't known he needed. "Where are you heading?" Elias asked. "West," Tanner replied. "Farther than most. But I'll be back this way soon. I'll spread the word. There's a lot of men out there who could use something like this." Elias didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he gave a short nod, watching Tanner turn and make his way down the path, Garrett following behind. As the two men disappeared into the distance, Elias knew this would be the first of many. Word would spread, and when it did, others would come, seeking his methods, wanting to understand how a cabin like his could withstand what the wilderness threw at it. Elias went back to his work, the weight of the storm's passing still heavy in the air. But it wasn't just the weather that had changed. The frontier, as it always did, was shifting, and Elias was no longer a solitary figure in the wilderness. His creation, his cabin, was part of something bigger now. Weeks passed since Tanner's visit, and the winds of winter began to howl again. Elias had grown accustomed to the quiet life, the solitude of the valley. He spent his days in the cabin, fixing what needed fixing, ensuring that everything was in order before the worst of the winter set in. But every now and then he would look to the horizon, wondering if the word would indeed spread, if others would come seeking the shelter he had built. So far, they had not. One afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the mountains, Elias heard the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. At first, he thought it was just the wind, carrying some distant sound to his ears. But then it came again, closer this time. His hand went instinctively to the rifle by the door, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he stepped outside, squinting into the fading light. A figure was approaching, silhouetted against the orange sky. It was a man, though Elias couldn't make out much of his features at first. The man wore a heavy cloak, the hood pulled low over his face to protect against the cold. As he came closer, Elias could see that he was younger than most who ventured out this way. Maybe in his late 20s, his face unshaven, and his eyes sharp but tired. When the man reached the cabin, he paused, glancing at the structure with obvious interest. Elias waited, silently studying him. "I hear you're the one who built this place," the man said, his voice a bit hoarse from the cold. Elias nodded. "I am?" The man stepped closer, his boots crunching the snow. "I've heard a lot about you, and I'm here to see if the stories are true." Elias didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had heard rumors of his cabin being discussed at trading posts and outposts, but he didn't expect to meet someone here, someone who had specifically come because of it. "You've traveled far," Elias said, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. "What brings you here?" The man shifted his weight, standing tall. "I'm looking for something that'll hold up in the wild, a place to keep me safe when the storm hits, something more than just a shelter, and they tell me you've got it." Elias studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come inside, I'll show you what I've built." The man's eyes flickered with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, but he stepped forward, following Elias into the warmth of the cabin. As the door shut behind them, Elias couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The storm was coming, it always did. But this time, there was something different. The cabin wasn't just his own shelter anymore. It was becoming something more. The storm hit the following evening, far fiercer than Elias had expected. The sky darkened rapidly, swirling clouds quickly blotting out the last light of day. By the time the wind picked up, howling like a predator in search of its prey, Elias knew the night would be long and punishing. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the cabin, with its sturdy walls and angled roof, stood firm against the storm. Elias wasn't alone this time. The stranger, whose name he had learned was Samuel, sat quietly in the corner, staring into the fire. The two men hadn't spoken much since the door closed behind them. Samuel had looked around the cabin with quiet admiration before settling in, accepting the warmth of the space without comment. Elias had gone back to his work, checking the fire and making sure everything was in order. Outside, the wind howled like a wild beast, shaking the structure with its ferocity. Yet Elias remained calm. His cabin, unlike the others in the valley, had been designed to withstand such tempests. The angled roof redirected the wind, and the strong corners and sturdy walls ensured the cabin would endure whatever nature threw at it. By midnight, the storm had grown violent. Snow flurries pounded against the windows, and the wind rattled the shutters, threatening to tear them free. Samuel looked up from the fire, his eyes darkened by the flickering light. "You built this to survive," he said, his voice low, almost in awe. "I can see that now. This isn't just shelter. It's a fortress." Elias gave a small nod but didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The cabin had already done its work. The storm outside raged with an intensity that might have torn apart any other structure, but the cabin stood resolute. The wind could batter the walls, the snow could pile high against the door, but inside, Elias felt no fear. There was no threat. Not here. For a while, neither man spoke. The fire crackled and popped, and the storm outside raged on. Elias moved toward the door, checking the canvas shutters and securing them in place. Samuel watched him in silence, then spoke again. "Your neighbors," Samuel said slowly, "they didn't believe in this. They laughed at you." Elias paused, his hand on the doorframe, staring out at the swirling snow. The words weren't new, but hearing them again brought a certain satisfaction. It had been a lonely road to this point. The ridicule, the doubts, the constant reminders that what he was doing wasn't normal. But it didn't matter now. The storm had shown them all. His cabin worked. "They'll be talking about this," Samuel continued, his tone almost thoughtful. "The wind's wild tonight. It's making me rethink what I thought I knew about shelter." Elias turned back toward the fire, his face illuminated by the warm glow. "I built this to survive," he said quietly. "I built it because I knew the wilderness wouldn't care about my plans. It doesn't care about my pride. It only cares about one thing: who can withstand it?" The two men sat in the silence of the cabin, the fire flickering as the storm continued outside. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but the quiet was filled with something deeper than the storm. The sense of knowing that, despite the harsh world beyond, they were safe. They were protected. And as Elias sat there watching the storm rage on, he knew one thing for certain: his cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a beacon, a symbol of what could be achieved when a man took a stand, ignored the laughter, and built something that could last. By morning, the storm had passed, but the aftermath remained. Snow had blanketed the landscape, covering the ground in a thick layer of white. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the valley, but it didn't matter. Elias had already been up for hours, checking the cabin's structure, ensuring it had withstood the full force of the night's test. When Samuel emerged from the warmth of the cabin, he was struck by the stillness of the morning. The wind had stopped howling, and everything around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The snow that had fallen during the night was thick and heavy, clinging to everything in sight. But there was one thing that stood out: the cabin. Elias's cabin. It was untouched. Not a single wall had shifted, not a single window cracked. The structure, despite the storm's full fury, had endured. "Damn," Samuel muttered under his breath. He had seen many cabins in his time, but none like this one. It really did hold up. Elias, standing just inside the doorway, watched him carefully. It wasn't meant to just survive. It was meant to last. Samuel took a few steps closer, running his hand over the sturdy walls, his fingers brushing against the tightly fitted logs. "You weren't just building something to get by," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You were building something that would change everything." Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. The cabin was its own answer. The storm, the one that had torn through the valley with unimaginable force, had done its best to destroy everything in its path. Yet the cabin had stood, unshaken. The walls had held strong, the roof had deflected the wind, and the foundation had remained solid. There was a new respect in Samuel's eyes now, a quiet understanding that had not been there before. He was a man who had lived on the frontier long enough to know the difference between a shelter and a fortress. He had seen too many men lose their homes to the elements, to storms, to wild animals, to the simple passage of time, but Elias's cabin was different. "People are going to come for this," Samuel said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're going to see what you've done, and they're going to want it for themselves. This place, it's not just a home, it's something more." Elias turned back toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the familiar space. The fire had burned low, but the warmth still lingered in the air. Everything was as it should be. It had worked. The test had come, and Elias had passed. The cabin had withstood the storm, and in doing so, it had proven its worth. "I didn't do it for them," Elias said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I did it for me, and anyone else who needs it." Samuel stood silent for a moment, letting the wind carry away his thoughts. "You've built something that'll last, Elias. Something that will change how people survive out here." As the two men stood together, watching the landscape stretch out before them, the truth of Samuel's words settled over Elias. The storm had come and gone, but his cabin, his creation, had endured. It had passed the test of time, the test of nature, and the test of men. And now it would stand as a testament to what could be accomplished when a man refused to accept the limitations of tradition. The weeks following the storm brought a chill that settled deep into the bones of the valley. Elias had prepared for winter, as he always did, with an eye to detail and a mind fixed on survival. The first snow had fallen early, but the harshest of the season was yet to come. His cabin, sturdy and unyielding, stood as a testament to the effort he had put into its design, but the true challenge was just beginning. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, amber glow across the room. The wind outside howled relentlessly, sending gusts of snow against the shutters. Elias sat at the small table, carefully sharpening his knives and tools, his movements deliberate. Samuel, who had stayed on for a while after the storm, sat across from him, his own rifle leaned against the wall. The two men hadn't spoken much since the storm. There was little to say. Elias's cabin had proved its worth, and Samuel, though a man of few words, had started to offer small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod, a quiet word of praise when something about the cabin caught his eye. Still, neither man had discussed what it all meant, not yet. They both knew what they had to do, survive. And for Elias that meant preparing for what was coming. The nights were long and the days short, with the sun barely rising above the horizon before dipping behind the mountains again. Samuel had ventured out a few times, checking his trap lines and gathering what little he could before the dead of winter set in. But it was too cold to stay out long, and the promise of food and warmth inside Elias's cabin was always an invitation. Elias had built the cabin with a certain pride, but now as the winter deepened, the pride was mingled with something else. Wariness. The valley outside was unforgiving, and Elias knew the storms would only grow worse. But this time he wasn't alone. Samuel, who had seen his fair share of winters, had remained behind, drawn not only by the comfort of the cabin, but also by something else Elias couldn't quite name. Was it respect, a need for safety, or perhaps the simple fact that two men could survive better than one? The first true test of the cabin came quietly. One evening, as the two men sat by the fire, a sudden snap broke the silence. It was a noise Elias knew well. The sound of something heavy hitting the cabin wall. It wasn't the wind, not this time. The noise came again, louder. Elias stood swiftly, his instincts kicking in. Samuel grabbed his rifle, eyes narrowing. Outside, through the small window, Elias could make out the shadowy shape of a large creature moving slowly across the snow. He knew at once it was a bear, a lone grizzly drawn to the warmth inside the cabin. The creature was testing the walls, probing for weakness. Elias didn't hesitate. He quickly secured the shutters, locking them in place, while Samuel readied his rifle. They had prepared for this, but still, there was something unsettling about seeing the beast outside their sanctuary. The grizzly was persistent, its claws scraping against the wood as it circled the cabin. Elias moved to the door, checking the tightness of the locks. He had built this cabin to keep such creatures out, but a part of him still couldn't help but wonder if this would be the night his work was truly tested. Samuel, standing beside him, was silent. But there was a glint of respect in his eyes. They both knew the bear wouldn't get in. Minutes passed. The wind howled, and then, as quickly as it had come, the bear moved off into the distance. Its heavy footsteps faded into the storm, and the silence of the valley returned. Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing. The cabin had held. The grizzly hadn't breached it. Samuel lowered his rifle, giving Elias a look of quiet approval. "That was close," Samuel said, his voice low. Elias nodded. "It won't be the last time." He knew that the winter was just beginning. The cabin had passed its first true test, but the harshest trials were still ahead. The storm outside had died down, but the real battle for survival had only just begun. The days that followed the bear encounter were filled with tension, but also a quiet sense of relief. Elias's cabin had held firm against the test of the wilderness. The storm had passed and the bear had moved on, leaving behind only the quiet reminder that the frontier was always watching. Yet, as winter settled in with all its harshness, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that there was a price to pay for such peace. It wasn't just the cold or the storms or the endless days of isolation. It was something more subtle, something that crept in with the long nights and the deep silence of the snow-covered valley. The price of survival on the frontier was a lonely one. Elias had chosen this life, and the cabin had given him something to hold on to, something to fight for. But now, with the long winter stretching ahead, he began to feel the weight of solitude pressing against him. Samuel had become a constant presence in the cabin. He was quiet, more reserved than Elias, but the company was appreciated. In the silence of the endless winter, their words were sparse but meaningful. When they spoke, it was usually about the land or the coming storms. Every now and then Samuel would share a small story from his past, but it was always brief, never lingering long enough to reveal too much. One evening, as Elias stoked the fire, he caught Samuel staring into the flames, his expression distant. The cabin was warm, the storm howling just outside, but the man beside him seemed far away, lost in his own thoughts. Elias watched him for a moment before speaking. "What's on your mind?" Samuel blinked, as if pulling himself back from some far-off place. He looked at Elias, his eyes sharp but weary. "I've been out here for years, Elias, chasing the game, living on the edge of it all. But sometimes it's too much. The wilderness has a way of swallowing you whole. You get used to it, but after a while you start wondering if it's all worth it." Elias didn't say anything at first. He had lived the same life, the same solitude, but he understood what Samuel was saying. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about the toll it took on a man. "You're not alone anymore," Elias said quietly. "You've got the cabin, and you've got a roof over your head." Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the foot. "I guess that's something." For a long time they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Elias knew that survival, at least on the frontier, came with a price, not just the cost of the land, but the cost of the isolation. The wilderness didn't care if you were alone or with others. It didn't care if you were strong or weak. It would take what it needed, and sometimes that was more than a man could give. But in that cabin, with the storm raging outside and the warmth of the fire keeping the cold at bay, Elias knew one thing for sure. The price of survival was high. But it was a price worth paying. The long, bitter winter finally began to wane, and with it, the grip of the cold released its hold on the valley. The winds that had howled relentlessly for months finally softened, replaced by the gentler breath of spring. Snow began to melt, trickling down from the mountains in small streams that cut through the thawing earth. The once frozen landscape began to stir, slowly coming back to life. Elias stepped outside one morning, the air sharp with the lingering chill, but beginning to carry the faint scent of fresh earth. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, warmed the skin as it climbed higher above the horizon. The first rays of spring had begun to seep into the valley, and Elias stood for a long moment, taking in the stillness of the morning. For months the valley had been buried beneath snow, the world outside his cabin a silent, frozen wilderness. Now, as the earth began to thaw, life seemed to return in small, tentative bursts. Birds sang in the distance, the call of a raven echoing across the valley. Even the trees, once stripped bare by winter, began to show signs of life, buds swelling on their branches. Samuel, who had been working on his traps and checking his supplies, came to stand beside Elias. He, too, looked at the horizon, his weathered face softening just slightly in the warmth of the sun. After so many months of the relentless cold, there was something almost nostalgic about the arrival of spring. "You can feel it, can't you?" Samuel asked quietly, his voice a mix of awe and weariness. Elias nodded, but didn't respond. The quiet of the valley was soothing, but there was something about the spring that always made him feel restless, as though it called him to something more. The isolation of winter had been harsh, but the thawing earth reminded him that there was always something more. life, movement, change. It was a subtle invitation to step back into the world. Spring, however, was not all peace and renewal. It was also a time of preparation, and Elias knew that the wilderness would still test him, even as it began to soften. The thawing earth brought new challenges. The snowmelt created swollen rivers, dangerous and fast-moving. And with the return of warmer weather came the wildlife, more active and hungry than before. Bears would soon be out of hibernation, and predators would begin to roam the land in search of food. Elias turned back toward the cabin, where the fire still smoldered low in the hearth. "We'll need to get ready," he said, his voice low and steady. "This isn't the time to relax. The spring brings its own dangers." Samuel didn't argue. They both understood the demands of survival on the frontier. Spring was a time of opportunity, but also one of vigilance. The thawing earth might promise new life, but it also reminded them both that they were far from safe. The wilderness would never give them a break. As the days grew longer, the two men set to work, preparing their traps, gathering what supplies they could, and reinforcing the cabin in case the bears came early. The air was lighter, the snow beginning to melt, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. The thawing valley around them seemed peaceful, but beneath that calm there was always the looming threat of the wilderness, and its call to those who dared live on its edge. The first sign of the approaching danger came at dusk, when Elias stepped out of the cabin to check the traps he had set earlier that day. The evening air was still cool, but there was a faint warmth in the breeze, a reminder that spring was well underway. As he walked through the snow-dappled forest, he couldn't help but notice the way the trees had begun to come alive again. The underbrush, once dead and dry, was beginning to show signs of new growth. Elias moved quietly, his boots pressing deep into the thawing earth, as he checked each trap with the practiced ease of someone who had lived off the land for years. The world around him was alive with the sounds of nature, the calls of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet were all familiar sounds. Yet there was something unsettled about the day. The air had the weight of something imminent, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time he reached the last trap, his instincts had fully kicked in. Something was wrong. The trap was empty, but the ground around it was disturbed. The snow turned up as if something had been pacing back and forth. His heart began to pound in his chest, and he instinctively looked around, scanning the tree line, listening for any hint of movement. And then he heard it. A low growl in the distance, deep and guttural. Elias's hand went instinctively to the rifle at his side, but he didn't draw it yet. The growl came again, louder this time, and Elias's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this. The bears had been emerging from hibernation, hungry and desperate after a long winter. But this felt different. It wasn't the quiet, cautious approach of a bear looking for food. This was a creature with purpose, a bear that had likely caught wind of his presence and was preparing to confront him. Elias's mind raced. The bear would be looking for an easy meal, and he was right in its path. He'd heard of bears attacking cabins in search of food, but he wasn't about to let that happen to his home. His cabin had held firm through storms, but it hadn't been tested by a bear in the spring, when hunger drove them to greater desperation. He stepped back toward the cabin, moving cautiously and silently, his eyes constantly shifting between the trees and the growing darkness. The growls echoed through the woods, louder and closer now, as the bear's approach grew more determined. Elias's heart hammered in his chest as he finally reached the cabin, his mind already calculating the best way to handle the situation. He needed to get inside, prepare, and get his rifle ready. Samuel was inside, likely unaware of the danger. Elias's fingers tightened around his rifle as he entered the cabin, slamming the door behind him. "There's a bear," Elias said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. "It's close. We need to be ready." Samuel looked up, his brow furrowing as he stood and grabbed his own rifle. "How close?" "Too close," Elias muttered. "This one isn't just looking for food, it's hunting." The two men moved swiftly, securing the windows, checking the strength of the door, and preparing for what was about to come. The cabin had withstood storms, but this would be its real test. The bear was out there, and it wasn't going to back down easily. Elias knew that the next few hours would be the longest of their lives. The bear's growls grew louder as Elias and Samuel prepared for what was to come. The sound of its massive feet crunching through the snow echoed through the quiet night, growing closer with each passing second. Elias moved to the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he tried to get a glimpse of the beast. "Get ready," he whispered to Samuel, who was already positioned near the door with his rifle in hand. The two men had been through enough hardships together to know that fear had no place in moments like these. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Elias kept his eyes trained on the forest outside, his heart beating hard in his chest. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made him tense. The bear was coming, and there was no mistaking its intent. It wasn't just curious or hungry. It was angry, driven by a force that couldn't be ignored. Suddenly the door rattled, the impact of the bear's claws scraping against the wood. Elias jumped back, his hand gripping the rifle tightly. Another impact, and then silence. Elias's pulse quickened. He held his breath, waiting. Was the bear gone? Or was it preparing for another attack? A shadow passed by the window, large and lumbering. The bear was circling, testing its prey. Elias could hear the creature's low growls now, a rhythmic, haunting sound that filled the room. It was just outside, waiting. Samuel's voice was a low murmur. "We can't let it get any closer. If it breaks in—" Elias nodded grimly. "We won't let it." With a quick motion, Elias lifted his rifle and moved to the door. They couldn't wait any longer. The bear was too close. As it circled the cabin, Elias could see its massive form outlined in the shadows. He aimed carefully, holding his breath, and fired. The shot rang out, splitting the night. The bear roared in pain, a ferocious sound that sent chills down Elias's spine. It stumbled backward, but then charged. The beast was enraged, lashing out in blind fury. Elias and Samuel both fired again, the gunshots echoing through the night. The bear hit the door with a tremendous force, but the cabin held. The wood creaked, but didn't break. Elias braced himself, his hands shaking but his aim steady. Another shot, another roar of pain, but still the beast pressed forward. With each passing second, the struggle became more desperate. Elias's rifle clicked empty. Samuel's was too. They had only one chance left. The cabin shook again, and Elias could feel the walls vibrating under the force of the bear's impact. The door creaked as the beast clawed at it, trying to tear its way in. There was no time left. The bear's desperation was palpable, its massive form slamming against the door with a power that made the entire structure tremble. Samuel stood beside Elias, both of them reloading their rifles quickly, the sounds of the bear's growls reverberating in their bones. "We don't have much left," Samuel said, his voice strained. "If it gets through that door—" Elias didn't let him finish. There was no if about it anymore. The bear was coming, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. Their only option was to end it. Elias took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling over him. The cabin, his creation, was holding, but just barely. He couldn't let the bear get any further. He couldn't risk losing everything. The next impact came harder than before, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. The door buckled, but it held. For now, Elias knew they had only moments before the bear would break through. He turned to Samuel. "We need to kill it now, together." Without waiting for a response, Elias moved quickly to the window. He could see the bear's enormous shape silhouetted against the snow, its eyes glowing with primal rage. It was too close now to miss. With one final, steadying breath, Elias raised his rifle again. Samuel was already in position, the cold steel of his gun ready to deal the blow. Together they aimed at the bear's chest, targeting its heart. The gunshots rang out in unison, two cracks that cut through the howling wind. The bear let out a guttural roar, a final agonizing cry that echoed across the valley. It stumbled, its massive body teetering before it collapsed into the snow. Elias lowered his rifle, his breath ragged but steady. He stood there for a long moment, watching the massive beast fall, its life extinguished by their coordinated effort. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The wind continued to howl, but the danger was gone. It was over. Samuel let out a long breath, the tension easing from his body. We did it. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a moment to process the enormity of what had just happened. He had built his cabin to withstand the storm, to protect him from the dangers of the wilderness. But now it had withstood the greatest test of all, not just the elements, but the beasts that roamed this land, creatures far more dangerous than the weather. Finally, Elias turned to Samuel. We did. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. And in that moment, as the wind began to calm and the storm began to break, Elias knew that his cabin had become more than just a shelter. It had become his fortress, a place where he and Samuel could stand, unbroken, against whatever the wilderness threw their way. The morning after the bear's attack, the landscape outside the cabin was quiet, eerily so. The wind had died down, and the sky was an overcast gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. Elias stood at the doorway, his eyes scanning the snowy horizon, his mind still grappling with the events of the night before. The bear lay just beyond the cabin, a massive, lifeless body now part of the wilderness. Its carcass, sprawled in the snow, was a grim reminder of what could have happened. Elias exhaled slowly, his breath mixing with the cold air as he stared at the animal that had nearly torn apart everything he had fought for. Samuel emerged from inside, wiping his hands on his coat. His expression was grim, but there was a faint sense of relief in his eyes. They had won, but the cost had been high. The fight had tested their resolve, and it had tested the cabin's construction in ways Elias hadn't anticipated. It had held, yes, but only just. "You think it's over?" Samuel asked, his voice low. Elias hesitated before answering. "For now. But there's more coming. Spring's just beginning. The bears, the wolves, they're waking up." Samuel nodded, his brow furrowed. "You built this cabin to withstand storms. But what about what comes after?" Elias knew what he meant. The winter was behind them, but the dangers of the wilderness were ever present. The spring thaw would bring new challenges, wildlife on the move, more predators and other threats they couldn't anticipate. It wasn't just about surviving one battle, it was about surviving the war that raged around them every day. "We'll adapt," Elias said quietly, his voice resolute. "We've faced worse. We're ready." And they were. The cabin had proven its strength. They had survived the storm, the bear, and the isolation. They had endured, and together they would face whatever came next. As they moved outside to begin the grim task of dealing with the bear's carcass, Elias felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in on him once again. It had been a long, hard winter, but now there was something new in the air, something that reminded him why he had built this cabin in the first place. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about resilience. And Elias knew that he and Samuel had what it took to survive anything. Days passed, and spring slowly began to reveal its warmth. The snow was melting faster now, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. The bear's carcass had been dealt with, its remains taken far from the cabin to ensure that no other predators would be drawn to it. Elias and Samuel had spent hours cleaning up the area, making sure the land around the cabin was clear of anything that might attract more danger. But the work didn't stop there. Elias knew that the cabin, despite its sturdy design, would need constant care. The shifting temperatures and the thawing ground would test its foundations. The logs that had held so strong in the winter might shift as the moisture from the spring melted into the earth. He worked tirelessly, reinforcing the roof, checking the structure for any signs of weakness. Samuel, on the other hand, had begun venturing out more frequently, checking his traps and scouting the land for anything unusual. The wilderness, though quieter now, still held its dangers. He didn't talk much, but Elias could see the shift in him. The man had changed after the bear attack. There was a quiet respect in his movements, a newfound awareness of the land around him. The wilderness had taught them both a hard lesson. It was never truly tamed. One afternoon, as Elias worked on the cabin, he heard the distant sound of footsteps. His hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side, but he relaxed when he saw Samuel walking back from the woods, a small grin tugging at his lips. "I saw a family of deer," Samuel said. "They're moving toward the higher ground. Looks like they're heading for the creek." Elias nodded, wiping his brow. The news was a small comfort, a sign that the land was waking up again, that life was returning after the harsh winter. He stepped back from his work, allowing himself a moment of peace. For the first time in months, there was a sense of calm between them. The wilderness was still wild, still unforgiving, but Elias had learned something in the past year. He had learned that survival wasn't just about building a strong cabin or fighting off bears. It was about understanding the land, listening to it, and adapting. As he looked around at the cabin he had built with his own hands, Elias felt a deep sense of pride. He had created something that would stand the test of time, something that would protect him, Samuel, and anyone else who came across it. And in that quiet victory, as the wind shifted, and the first rays of spring broke through the clouds, Elias knew that the hardest challenges were behind them. The future, whatever it might hold, was theirs to shape. The days grew longer, and the warmth of spring settled over the valley like a soft blanket. Elias stood outside his cabin, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, casting a golden hue across the land. The battle with the wilderness, the bear, and the harsh winter had been fought and won. The cabin had withstood it all, standing firm in the face of everything the wild had thrown at it. Samuel was sitting nearby, sharpening his axe, his movements steady and practiced. There was a quiet satisfaction in his demeanor, a sense that they had earned the peace they now found. They had built something together, survived together, and learned the land together. The wilderness was still a fierce opponent, but they had become its equals. Elias looked at the cabin, a symbol of their resilience. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a part of them, a legacy that would remain long after they were gone. The world around them was alive with the sounds of the new season. Birds chirped, trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the creek murmured in the distance. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a sense of calm, knowing that the future, whatever it might bring, was one they were ready to face together. As time passed, the land around the cabin flourished, the trees growing taller, the animals becoming more abundant. Elias and Samuel, though weathered by the harsh winters and trials of the wilderness, had become part of the landscape themselves. Their presence was no longer just a fleeting mark on the earth, but a testament to the strength of survival and resilience. The cabin, standing tall against the elements, had become a symbol of what they had accomplished, a place that had sheltered them through storms and battles, both external and internal. Elias knew that one day others would pass through this land, seeking the safety and peace they had found. He had no illusions about leaving behind a grand legacy, but in the simplicity of the cabin, he had built something that would endure, a place that would stand as proof of their survival. As he sat by the fire, Samuel at his side, Elias felt a quiet peace settle in. They had survived the wilderness, and in doing so, had found something even more valuable, a place to call home. The world outside might change, but the cabin would remain, a lasting legacy of their journey.